you need to know when and where to get your profit in each of these games. And if you try to get your profit in the wrong spot, you're just leaving profit, growth, and cash flow on the table.
You need to be selfish in your business. If you're putting that investment in, you need to see that return in a reasonable period of time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Free to Go CFO podcast, where we dive deep into conversations about scaling a profitable D2C brand. I'm your host, John Blair, founder of Free to Go CFO. We are the go-to outsourced finance and accounting firm for 8- and 9-figure D2C brands. All right, we are back, and I am super pumped to have my buddy Carl O'Brien from Store Hero back on the show. Carl, what's up, man?
Great to see you, John. Always good to catch up.
Yeah. Was this your second or third time on the show? I don't know. You've been on at least once. I feel like it's been twice. I'm not sure.
Yeah, our conversation's always great to the extent that I'm piecing in my head what was recorded and what isn't, but it's always
we should be recording every one of our conversations should be a podcast in all honesty. But I'm glad to have you back on. We're talking today about what we at Free to Grow CFO call the high-LTV or subscription game. And so to set the stage for the conversation, we've been talking a lot about the fact that Free to Grow CFO does something unique. Being a D2C focused fractional CFO firm, we have developed what we call the FTG growth marketing game playbook. What we've learned over the years and working with over 100 brands is that every D2C brand is playing one of three growth marketing games, either the high LTV game, the new customer dominant game, or the apparel game. It's important to put a brand in one of those three buckets because they all have different unit economic factors, different new versus returning customer sales dynamics, and that dictates what the brand needs to do from a playbook standpoint, from a tactics and strategy standpoint to scale fast, profitable, and cash flow positive. And so today we're going to dive into the high LTV game. So to get us started, Carl, from your perspective, what differentiates the high LTV game or subscription game from the other games that a brand can play as they're trying to scale?
Sure, it's a great way to put it, and we do something really similar where we talk about it as kind of profit now, profit soon, or profit later. And I think definitely touching on the same points. And practically, I think one piece that I know in our conversations, Free to Grow, you guys do this really well. And at Store Hero, we try to do it well, is pull the kind of marketing metrics and put them in the context of your fundamental business principles. So like, let's think about this in the most rational way possible. Like, what am I willing to pay to acquire a customer? And well, the answer to that is going to be, well, what am I getting in return? And for us, it really falls into those three categories. I'm going to be willing to give up my margin on my first order, not because I'm a charity. It's because I know there's more profit to come later. So again, to be really precise around how we think about that, it's a lot of these kind of people will have heard us, I'm sure, talking about this in the past, but maybe often don't institute it. It's like, well, what do you mean by LTV? And what time period are you looking at? Those are the logical next questions. From our perspective, it needs to be fully loaded cost of goods. What sort of profit am I actually generating? And that's over time. So if I can clearly see I generate $50 of profit on first order, 75 by month 2, and 92 by month 3, I'm in such a clear position to assess the value of that customer, to go back to that question, because I know what I'm getting in return.
Well, okay, so there's an important distinction, and you made this at the end, right? Which is that it's not just what are you going to get in return, it's when are you going to get it, right? Because we've realized there is actually a second high LTV game. Generally, we see that in apparel. There is generally a brand that has raving fans, does have high LTV, but it's over a much longer time period. And so those brands generally can't afford to lose money on new customers. We call our first order profitability rule for most apparel brands is we call break even-ish on new customers. And sometimes if the brand's been around long enough and there's like multiple years of returning customers, they might be able to turn a small loss on new customers. But it's not when you differentiate this from the subscription game, the high LTV subscription game, you can actually have an accelerating loss on new customers potentially if you have the right LTV dynamics. And so to summarize this for the audience, it's like, it's not just LTV in margin dollars, not revenue dollars. It's LTV velocity. How fast does it accumulate? And generally speaking, to differentiate this from the apparel high LTV game, we have to see sufficient LTV in margin dollars, typically within a 3 to 6 month period. I even like to see it. Well, here's something I want to debate with you, because you look at a lot of data, just like I do on the cohort side. I tell a brand without looking at any of their data, generally speaking, you've got to break even. Your CAC needs to get paid back by your LTV and margin dollars by month 6 at the latest, but generally month 3 to 4 is where we typically like to see that. There is nuance depending on a lot of different factors, but what is your perspective on that?
Definitely. I think ultimately there has to be a solid rationale, I would say, for any time you want to go over maybe that 3 month, and especially if it's 6, you're probably working your way backwards and kind of fixing maybe a lack of a profitability focus in the business. But practically, oftentimes as well, I think after you get to that point, the customer that you're kind of on that concentric circles of the work Meta and Google have to do to go out, take your budget and grab and find those customers,
Yeah,
you're going to see a reduction in quality in some of those cases. The other piece as well is, okay, it doesn't do you much justice to say, okay, I get profitable after month 6 if my average subscription lifespan is 7 months or,
for sure. Yeah,
8
yeah.
months or
So you
whatever.
have like 1 month of generating profit from that cohort, right?
Exactly. And even in a broader context, I see this in our kind of profit LTV view is like, okay, well, practically, if you're doing all that work, let's say you generate $50 of profit on first order, and that incrementally grows to maybe $60 by kind of month 12, let's say. So, an opposite to this scenario we're talking about. Now, let's think about it in a logical format. You're not going to give up $50 to gain an extra 10. That doesn't make sense. So it's, again, you need to be selfish in your business. Like, if you're putting that investment in, you need to see that return in a reasonable period of time. And the other piece I'd say in that as well is, like, oftentimes people will go back and, figure what the logical next question here is, like, okay, how can I map out what are my customer acquisition cost scenarios? How much should I be willing to spend to acquire a customer? And what does that do for my business over time? But, at the same time, you're working from a much more solid foundation if you understand that true profit LTV. And there needs to be a logical rationale as to why you give that up. People that I think are more aggressive and waiting a bit longer is they have a much more mature repeat customer base that
Exactly, exactly.
they can absorb that kind of cash flow burden. I know when we spoke previously, I used a similar analogy, but it's like you're giving a mini loan to that customer, waiting for them to
Totally.
come back and repay. They need to be, you need to give that loan on good terms and know it's for the greater good for your business.
Well, okay, so a couple things I want to, we're going a little out of order, but I want to dive into this because whenever I talk to a brand and I haven't seen their data, I say 6-month payback at the longest, but I really bet it's probably got to be 3 to 4 months. We do have bigger brands we work with that are maybe doing 20, 30, 40 million in revenue. They've been around for many years. And when you say that they're kind of their cohorts or their customer base is more mature, what I think about is this analogy of like layers on a cake, right? If you're a brand that's only been around for a year or two and people drop off on average at month 9, when you get to year 2, you're really the layers of the cake only go back to 9 months ago. But let's say we have a couple brands we work with that are even doing like maybe 12 to 15 million in revenue right now, but their like 24-month LTV is crazy, right? So if you're at any point in time, you have layers of the cake that go back 2 years. So you're getting all of this LTV from not just the last 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, and then beyond. That is a brand that maybe we might be able to stretch the payback out now to 6 months or 7 months, but it relies on knowing how to analyze the data in the right way to give you the certainty that you can take a bigger risk on that loss. There's one other thing you mentioned about like making a loan, and you talked about the word investment. You do have to look at this from a finance perspective, which is kind of a return on investment over time and factor in the time value of money. You mentioned that, like, let's say by month 7, you're going to break even in month 6, and by month 7, you have $10 in lifetime, contribution margin, and your CAC was $5. You made $5 on a $50 investment over 6 or 7 months. You gotta annualize that and say, like, was that a sufficient return on capital? Right? Was that sufficient for the risk of waiting 6 months to break even and waiting 7 months to make a $5 profit? And so this does actually come back to risk versus expected return at the end of the day. And so I'm just throwing this out there because it's not all just back in the day, I feel like during COVID and like when the e-commerce like COVID boom was happening, people were just like, if your CAC to LTV is 3-1, you're good. And it's like, well, maybe. And is that revenue-based LTV? Over what time period are you talking about? Because if your revenue, like LTV to CAC by month 12 is 3-1, it might be okay. It probably isn't, especially once you convert that to gross margin dollars. So these are the things you need to think about. So let me just summarize, and then I want to dive into something else here. So with a high LTV brand, subscription brand, you have sufficient LTV in margin dollars and velocity, meaning that by month 3 or 4, generally speaking, you can break even, but that it keeps accumulating beyond that break even point, sufficient enough to provide like enough profit to make the risk of losing money on new customers worth it. Okay. That's what we're talking about here. Let's now talk a little bit about I'm just curious, where do you see in your conversations with brands and looking at brands data, where do you usually see the CAC to LTV game break down? Is there a common thing or things that stops working at a certain amount of scale that brands should be looking out for?
Sure. I think ultimately it's going to be, different sides of the coin in each brand, of course, but naturally it always comes down to two things. It's either the retention isn't as maybe strong as they would have hoped, and they're investing for a customer that isn't driving additional incremental margin, or that acquisition cost has crept up to the extent that, they're waiting till month 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 to acquire the same volume of customers. So again, in the reality of business, they're often the drivers for these things. They're not often it's a positive situation where, okay, we're just scaling into it and then it kind of happens. That's definitely
Yes.
a big part of it. I would say the way I would try to encourage brands to look at it is, and it's one feature that's been really well received from a store hero perspective, is lifetime value by first purchase. Because I think that actually takes this conversation from like you get a view of where you are at a business level. You understand where you are versus where you need to be. But now it's like, okay, how do we actually do something about that? So if we take a look at what are all the products that are acquiring customers, what sort of profit does that product drive us on first order? And based on customers buying that first, what does their LTV look like over time? So that's obviously really interesting for its own sake to know, okay, product A has a much better retention rate, it's a better foundation, but practically it gets to solve the underlying challenge that someone is even trying to explore in the first place, which is actually, instead of crossing my fingers and hoping that my meta acquisition cost drops, how can I give myself the most amount of levers in front of me to control a positive outcome? And one of those
Totally.
reasons is if I can give myself an ability to spend more. To kind of really put this in perspective, a great example of like a high LTV supplements business, they launched a starter pack, the trial pack. It was a really low profit per order. Their channel performance looked really poor, but we could immediately see that exposing a customer to multiple products within the family of the brand meant that we had a ton of different opportunities for them to find a product that they were interested in, and the profit after 3 months was twice as high as compared to doing a sample pack of one of their products. So
Interesting.
in that case, they've the same kind of revenue conceivably, they've the same marketing spend, but they've focused on the underlying behavior that gives them more room to spend and actually helps that LTV without doing anything else.
Okay, so there's a couple things that we need to kind of like drill down on here that I want to make sure the audience hears. The first one is the way that I think about it is like a seesaw, right? That's the metaphor. And the seesaw is CAC and LTV accumulation, I call it, but LTV velocity over time. You may start, you analyze your cohort model with a CFO or with Store Heroes data, and you're like, okay, I am shooting for a 3-month payback, right? And with the data that I have, that means I can spend up to a $50 CAC, right? And so you go and you try to spend as much as you can up to a $50 CAC, but then what do you need to do? You need to stop, look at the data again, measure and say, hey, did the CAC to LTV seesaw stay in balance? Because what one of the things that Carl is saying is like, if the CAC side of the seesaw starts to go up and LTV is not keeping up, right? You're going to have to pull back spend or do something to drop CAC back down to bring the seesaw back in the other direction. You actually don't want LTV to get out too far ahead of CAC, because then you're actually leaving new customer acquisition on the table. And so you're playing this balancing act game of like, you are trying to push CAC as high as it can feasibly go, but you're trying to keep pushing LTV up to balance out that seesaw. And if you can, and that's basically the game that you're playing for the rest of your life when you're playing the high LTV game. And so that's the first thing I wanted to kind of reiterate. The second thing is that looking at segmented cohort analysis. That's kind of what you're talking about, like whether it's at the offer level or the SKU level. You do need to get segmented and go a layer or two deeper to understand what is driving your new customer acquisition and what's driving your LTV. Certainly there are more, I'll call it like funnel level or global level tactics, like how are you running your email marketing and whatnot. But you also need to go back and look at like what offers and SKUs are really driving acquiring a new customer and what's the LTV of that cohort of customers. So one thing we like to do on the CFO side, at the very least, is look at a cohort model from the perspective of subscribers versus non-subscribers, right? One thing that we found is that one thing that you can that has been very successful for high LTV brands that we've worked with is helping them to actually lose more money on a new customer in exchange for a subscription opt-in. And it's counterintuitive, but it's because when we look at the cohort data for subscribers, it has such higher LTV velocity over time that we can pay back a steeper loss, actually even quicker sometimes than we can pay back a one-time purchase or a non-subscriber acquisition. And so we've been able to counterintuitively help brands offer an even steeper subscription opt-in discount, lose more money in month 1, but by month 6 and beyond, they're way more profitable. Do you have any takes on that?
We see it all the time. Like, I think the resounding point there as well is like, I think everything is difficult. I'm not saying anything is easy, but I often think it's easier to get the right, even if it's a good offer, if the LTV can prove it out to capture more profit later on, then oftentimes trying to maximize profit on that first order, because realistically, you don't need to do it. And it's actually a more difficult job sometimes. Like I had a call with a brand there in the last couple of days only, and one of their big focuses was actually can we reprice to give ourselves more margin on first order? And I was kind of saying, you've actually a consumable product. Your LTV is really strong. To add an extra incremental, maybe $2-3 of gross profit on first order resets your expectations versus competitors in an otherwise competitive category. If you actually get somebody to come back one more time, you generate 5 times more profit than that. So therefore, in other words, if 20% of your customers come back once more, you've captured the same level of profit. You've served the customer better, who's gotten validated your business by purchasing one more time, and you have had no negative consequence of passed on additional cost. So it's like, I think oftentimes what can happen with kind of, our media buying being the levers in front of us on a daily basis, that causes us sometimes to make all our changes through that prism. A spend adjustment, should we spend more or less? If you can put yourself in a position where you have more levers in front of you, you have more optionality, then you can see, again, easier pathways to actually achieve the underlying goal you want to achieve.
Yeah, you just made such an important point right now. The reason why we are rallying our CFO service for D2C brands around this growth marketing game playbook is because of what you just said, which is that you need to know when and where to get your profit in each of these games. And if you try to get your profit in the wrong spot, you're just leaving profit, growth, and cash flow on the table. And I'm not saying that to scare brands. I'm saying that because me and my team did not realize that 4 years ago as clearly as we realize it today. And it's the truth. If you are trying to overemphasize first order profitability in a high LTV brand, you might actually be damaging your profitability and not even realize it. I actually talked to a brand recently that's doing $8 million a month in revenue. And I looked at their cohort model and I was like, dude, why are you making money on first orders? Like, we should be losing money on first orders. And he's like, well, honestly, like, I don't have a CFO, so like I'm scared to lose money on first orders. He's like, can I? And I'm like, yes, I'm looking at just a couple of data points and I am certain. How much can you lose? I need to, we need to work together and we need to dive deeper to see how much you can lose. But I am certain that just based on the LTV that I'm not even converting to margin dollars. When you look at a cohort model in revenue dollars and you don't even need to convert it to margin dollars, you're just like, I know this works. I don't know the exact CAC target, but like you should be spending more. I was just like, dude, I know you can spend more. And he's like, okay, like I'm willing to listen, but like and until I get a CFO, I'm not doing it because I'm scared. And I think that is such an important thing to understand, that like a lot of times the reason why brand founders are not following this playbook is just because they don't have the confidence to know that it's giving them a higher ROI than trying to protect first order profitability. And that's why that's why I got you on the show. That's why we're trying to hammer this message out in our marketing, because we want brands to know this is possible. It is possible to do this. You just got to have the right data and you have to have the right people on your team, right?
100%. Like it's the equivalent of, I think sometimes it feels like to do nothing is a safer bet, but to do nothing, not scale, is an action in and of itself.
For
So
sure.
ultimately, like we see this as well, even in the context of things like platform-based ROAS. In the absence of
Dude,
information,
please don't
yeah,
start me on platform-based ROAS.
you know, I'm bringing it down the rabbit
I've
hole.
been fighting lots of brands about that recently.
Yeah, especially, and I think it's true in this category of customers more than anyone else. It's like it feels like a higher ROAS is safer, and ultimately, like the kind of the confusion and malaise around like all the air in the room being taken up by kind of fighting attribution tools rather than clarity on these true numbers has just meant that we haven't even got to this higher level of conversation. A lot of times, we're still
For sure.
fighting around which channel deserves which kind of split or part of the halo effect. So in this context, like this, I'm sure there's plenty of reasons for that. I know across Europe, there's like a bit of an aftershock from like even the financial crisis, that's coming up
Totally.
probably 15 years ago, more than that at this point. But there's all these kind of over last effects, even COVID in the last couple of years, making sure that you're dealing with the situation in front of you. And I think oftentimes, I'm sure you find the same, the expectation is like us as a store hero, yourselves as a fractional CFO, okay, we're going to come in and we're going to be the pessimists in the room and pull back, do less, contract your activities. But actually, that's not often these are the most exciting conversations, I'm sure, for yourself as well, whenever you see that cohort chart. So for anyone who doesn't have visibility on that, I'd really recommend, it's such a clarifying point to see the realities of your business. Like what's been really exciting is we've had a bunch of businesses raise big rounds, and it would nearly be like the core part of their pitch deck was that Store Hero LTV page or Profit LTV.
I love it.
It's really exciting when there's an opportunity to be gained there.
And look, I want to be clear. I understand that it can be complicated to process that, lifetime LTV and margin dollars against CAC. It's challenging. Honestly, most CFOs don't understand it. And the thing is, though, as the founder, you do need to understand why these dynamics matter, but you can bring people and resources onto your team to be the experts to understand it at a very detailed level. That's where SaaS tools like Store Hero and service providers like Free to Grow CFO can come alongside you and do the detailed work, right? That you don't need to do. You just need to understand the takeaway, and you need to understand the high level dynamics, and you need to understand like them enough to be able to say, yes, let's make this decision, right? And so just remember that you don't have to do this all alone. There's one thing I want to dive into before we close up here: how inventory planning impacts the high LTV game. I have some really strong opinions about this, but I'm just curious, what is your take on why inventory planning is so critical to the high LTV game?
100%. I think, it's not all kind of investment expression. It's like past performance doesn't indicate future return.
Yeah,
Okay, but it certainly gives us a pretty good indication sometimes, especially if you've built up as a business a pretty good model of what that looks like. I think practically you have this kind of fire hose of spend driven through ad channels that ultimately works based on certain principles being in your business. Like I think these high LTV businesses are in as strong a position as anyone to actually be able to model that stuff out. Like we see businesses who aren't developing, like think of something like furniture is like the inventory planning is so difficult to do because ultimately every customer feels like a new customer because it's so long by the time they're actually coming back.
For
So like
sure.
the piece that's been really interesting from our perspective is actually piloting features within our cloud connector for Store Hero. So think about that as like a really intelligent tool to validate and understand your sales, marketing, and profit all in the conversations you're having with these tools. If you can actually take that context and apply it back to your inventory and demand planning, it's so beneficial because there's
Totally.
so much modeling you can do there, which is exciting. But I think like again, it's the benefit of having I think someone like yourselves that understands the messy, practical, real world realities of implementing this fancy plan. Oftentimes, these plans can fall down in execution if they don't deal with the realities of your business. And again, there's so much you can do to kind of reverse engineer that. I know we've had a ton of
Absolutely.
conversations on that.
Yeah, man. I mean, inventory planning is so key for this game because if you run out of subscription inventory, that's like the cardinal sin. If you run out of SKUs that are on subscription, you can kiss that LTV goodbye and the whole CAC to LTV game breaks down. And so it's critical to get, at the very least, your subscriber inventory nailed. And one other thing that we help brands think through is like the segments of risk of your inventory. So your new customer forecast is actually the riskier inventory forecast. That's why you're saying with furniture, it's so much riskier to do inventory planning because almost every purchase is a new customer. And it's a lot harder to forecast new customer acquisition than it is subscribers or repeat purchase, right? And so you got to think about your demand plan in terms of your new customer demand plan and your returning customer demand plan, and you don't want to screw up the returning customer demand plan. And in fact, you should probably even order a little bit extra. And you actually can, because the subscription de-risks that inventory purchase quite a bit. So anyways, look, man, before we wrap up here, can you just tell everyone a little bit about Store Hero and where they can find more information about you guys?
Yeah, no problem at all. And great to chat as always. From my perspective, I started as a founder of a digital marketing agency, working with e-com brands, getting that vantage point of trying to kind of give a clear picture of marketing and finance. So from a Store Hero perspective, is very much built in that view where in order to make active decisions, whether I'm an agency, whether I'm a brand, whether I'm a management team of a brand, I need to be able to understand the profit impact of my decisions. So people like yourself, John, at the results at the end of the month are actually those decisions that have been made on a daily basis are being done through the lens of profitability. So for Store Hero, and that's by way of a unified dashboard. But now, actually, for the majority of our users, it's interacting with our AI growth coach, which sits within your cloud account. And instead of your team grabbing scattered ChatGPT screenshots without proper business context, it understands your goals, your margins, your products, your full view of your business to give you really sense-checked, reliable recommendations that are extremely clarifying to help translate not only data, but turn it into clear actions, which has been really exciting to do.
So awesome, man. I love what you guys are building over there. And Carl, like seriously, thank you for coming back on. The way that you break down the high LTV game through your actual experience as opposed to just theory, it's the exact kind of clarity that our audience needs. They're making big decisions about trying to scale the high LTV game to grow fast, profitably, and cash flow positive. And so thanks again, man. I always love having you on, and we'll definitely be doing this again soon.
Likewise. Thanks again.
Don't forget, if you liked today's episode, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. It helps us reach more people like you. Also, if you want daily tips on scaling a profitable D2C brand, follow me, John Blair, on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in learning more about how Free to Grow CFO can help your brand increase profit and cash flow as you scale, check us out at freetogrowcfo.com.